Everyone, Sean Lyons here from Grow, and this is our final webinar that we're doing as part of Mental Health Awareness Week. And I guess it's one of my personal highlights that I've brought a good friend, a new friend, but somebody who I sense that I've got a close kinship with, having recently read his book, actually still working through some of his books. I've had to go back and rethink some stuff. And I really want to introduce Rory O'Connor. He's a professor at the University of Glasgow, and he's a specialist in suicide prevention. And his recently published book, When It Is Darkness, Why People Die by Suicide and What We Can Do to Prevent It, is not only a rip snorter, but it's actually a personal commentary on his experience for being many years in researching suicide, being touched by suicide personally in his life, and some of the challenging thoughts I guess many of us have about processing the whole concept of suicide and what we could have done differently. Rory, I really welcome you, and tell us a bit about yourself.
Well, I'm delighted to be here, Sean, and thanks for the invitation. I'm really excited to be having this conversation with colleagues in New Zealand, a place I love visiting. Unfortunately, obviously, we can't do that. I was meant to be in New Zealand last year, and that was obviously cancelled because of COVID. So I really hope to see your beautiful country again sometime soon.
Okay, I've got a red wine sitting waiting for you next year, okay?
That sounds good. That sounds good to me. That sounds good. In terms of a bit about my background, so I'm a psychologist by training. I've been working in the field of suicide research and suicide prevention for 25 years now, and I started out in the mid-1990s doing my PhD on this very topic, understanding suicide, and actually what we would have described then as parasuicide, which is a term we don't use anymore, and it's actually something I talk about in the book, the whole use of language and how we talk about these difficult topics. So yeah, in terms of what I've been doing for the last 25 years is I've been trying to think about why, first of all, why people become suicidal in the first place, why people act on their thoughts of suicide, and then really what we can do to help. And so with my research group at the University of Glasgow, it's a multidisciplinary team. So and I think that's really important when we think about understanding and preventing suicide, and no one single profession has all the answers in understanding this such a complex phenomenon. And what I've been trying to do is use different methods of research, both qualitative methods in terms of interviews, as well as obviously most of our work is primarily quantitative, and we're trying to really understand how the different pieces of this puzzle, which leads to the perfect storm of factors in whatever 703,000 people is whatever the latest estimates by the World Health Organization lead people to die by suicide. And really what I've tried to do with the book, which is obviously a quick picture of the book, which is for some reason it looks reversed here, but I think when you see it, you can see it properly. Perfect of it. Is, I suppose it is, yeah, I've been working for 25 years, and one of the things I've always been really keen to do was a lot of my work is I try and get it out of the ivory towers anyway, and because for the work that we do in my lab, it's useless unless it reaches the people at the front line. And the people at the front line could be clinicians, or they could be teachers, or they could be people with their own experiences of caring for people who are suicidal, or people who are suicidal themselves. And for me, it's really important that we get whatever understanding we can accrue to those people. And what I've tried to do with the book really was over the last few years, I've been thinking about how could I reach people beyond the talks that I would give across the country and internationally, reach people who don't read scientific papers. And what I've tried to do then with the book is to bring together my knowledge, or disseminate my knowledge of what I've learned, both professionally from the work that I do, but as you mentioned at the start there, Sean, also my own personal experiences of being twice bereaved by suicide, and also we all have a mental health. So it's trying to bring that together in a way which hopefully is accessible to people, but crucially will help those who are vulnerable, or who are supporting those who are vulnerable. And that could also be people bereaved by suicide. And indeed, one of the things I think is so important when we think about suicide prevention is, and one of the great things when I reflect on the last 25 years of how the field has changed and moved forward, is the central voice now of people with lived and living experience of suicide and mental health. That has really, really resonated, that emphasis, and it's so important. And so the other thing I tried to do with the book was give a voice to the countless people I've met over the last 25 years who've either been bereaved or have been suicidal or who are supporting loved ones, to try and give them a voice in the book. And so that's sort of a very long way around of saying I've been working in the field a long time, and this is my sort of attempt to hopefully get the message of compassion, dispel myths, highlight the complexity, highlight the role we can all play in understanding, preventing suicide, and supporting each other.
Yeah, I read the bit in your book where you did a TV interview, and you, for the first time, publicly shared the impact that losing your friend Claire had on you. And you made a statement in that you said you wouldn't have written this book had you not done that experience. How, I guess, we all have our comings out, but how, that seems like it was pretty fundamental to you.
Yeah, no, it was. It was so my friend Claire died in 2008, and we were really close friends. And the year before she died, just to give a bit of context, the year before she died, she got married to her long-term partner, and there was 4 of us at the wedding. There was 2 witnesses. My wife and I were the 2 witnesses, and it was Claire and Dave, and it was the most beautiful ceremony at Edinburgh Castle. It was just stunning. And then a year later, Claire had died, and as I talk about in the book, although we talked about her struggles over our many years of friendship, the thing was, first of all, I was just floored by the devastation and impact it had on me. Which, even though before Claire had died, I thought I had some sense, because I've spoken to so many people who'd been bereaved, I had some sense of what that felt like. But until it happened me directly, I on reflection, I didn't. And I suppose it took me a long time then to think about, to process Claire's death. And I think that for the first few years, it was all about just I don't know, trying to just accept that she wasn't here or there. And then, but I didn't talk about it at all. I didn't talk about it, and like, as I mentioned in the book, I didn't know at the time in 2008, I didn't know if I could continue working in the field, because literally every single day I get up and do something on suicide, either research or write something or whatever it may be. So, and I didn't anticipate how difficult that would be, but thankfully I did make the decision. I stayed in the field. But it was this contained. But I did this contained thing. I like to think of myself as very boundaried, and my research was one bit, and my personal life was a different bit. And this, when Claire's death had happened, that boundary had been blurred and had been crossed, and of course it highlighted to me the absolute. I've always known, and we all know, about how difficult it is to prevent suicide. But when it happened to me, I just felt like a complete failure. So there's a lot of shame and feeling a failure that I really struggled with. And I talk in the book, then obviously, then in my early 40s, started seeing a therapist, and that's been probably the most important other decision I've made in regard to my mental health. But just getting back to your question, the reason for giving that sort of backstory, because that is important for me to think about. So I'd spent all these years, in some ways, whether building a reputation as somebody who does good science, and he's a good communicator. This is what I obviously was trying to do, and I just couldn't make that step, about that leap forward into talking about the personal experience. And then in 2015, so that's maybe obviously some years later, after Claire's death in 2008, and I was acting as an advisor on a BBC documentary, Life After Suicide. And again, that program had been a long time in the gestation. And I've been given lots of advice on how it would work and how we would talk about the psychology and the suicide risk and so on. And then literally with all the filming dates in place, and there's still no plan for me to talk about my own experiences of loss, because also not just Claire, obviously my mentor, my first mentor, also took his own life. But then it was like, I think one of the days before we were planning the filming, and the director said to me, would you mind, what do you think about you talking about your own experiences? This program's about living life after suicide. And initially my gut reaction was no. And it was because I just was so bounded and so contained. But then I reflected on it overnight and a couple of nights maybe, and then I just said, to heck with it. This is just ridiculous. I don't talk about it. It's such an important event in my life. It's so important in how I now approach the work that I do. And then it was pretty emotional then, obviously, doing the filming on camera, and a bit of that is in the final film, but much of it isn't in the cut. But it was for me, it was like, a sense of freedom that I'd shared this experience. But then what I didn't know was how people would react to it. And actually the feedback was just remarkable in terms of people saying, oh, it's really helped them. Because obviously everybody in the film talks about their own experiences, but it's because I was meant to be this so-called expert, whatever that means, or whatever in the sort of research. And then so that day then, or once that was broadcast and the feedback was that it helped others, I promised myself that from then onwards, I would talk about my experiences and bring it to the talks that I give and the research I do and talk openly. And that's what I've done. And then that's a very long way of getting to your point about, and that's why I genuinely don't think I would have written the book, or if I did, it would be a very different book. I think then the other thing I struggled with when writing the book was, because even though I'm I have this facade of being an expert, extrovert, positive guy, and I am some of those things, but obviously I'm also incredibly insecure and all the other things. And I couldn't work on a way in which, or couldn't settle in a way in which I could write a book which people would want to read, first of all, but would convey something of my personal experiences, but without giving away too much. And again, as I write in the introduction of the book, I had this eureka moment on holiday in Crete, of all places, and I just couldn't sleep one night. And then I just was able to see, I just had this light bulb moment of being able to see a way in which I could make it all in my head fit for me, work for me. And then that led, so then the next morning I wrote the first several hundred words of the book. And then the last bit I'll say on this, then again, it's covered in the book, either at the start or at the epilogue. No, this is in the epilogue. The bit which was then most, well, to my mind, incredible was, so I decided I was writing this book. I was going back to the UK and I was going to find a publisher, but I wanted a mainstream, I didn't want an academic publisher. I wanted a publisher, like one of the big publishers. And then this unbelievable coincidence was, like, summer holidays is the only 2 weeks in the year I turned my email off completely for that length of time. Turned my email on, and I was scrolling through all these backlogs, and I saw an email which was from a publisher, which I just thought was, because you often get these emails saying, would you review this manuscript or this proposal for a book? So I just ignored it. And then I came back on it. And then the most bizarre was this lady, Sarah, who was on maternity leave, and she's a publishing director for Penguin Random House, the big publishing company. And she was like, I'm really keen to write one. I'm thinking of some projects when I come back from maternity leave, one of which is a book on suicide, a popular science book which can reach the masses type thing. And I just couldn't believe it, because it was just literally the emails I just got. So then I worked with Sarah, and then whatever, 18 months later, or COVID in between, the book's here. So it's an amazing set of coincidences, which is all true. It's not even just written for the sake of the book. This all happened, and that's a bit for me, which makes it very powerful for me. It's a very, as you said already, Sean, such a personal book. And indeed, this my attic at home is where I wrote most of it, and I shed a lot of tears over writing it, because only recounting my own personal experiences of loss, but then just remembering all the people I've met on my journey who shared their stories. So I find it much more painful, cathartic, and ultimately, hopefully, restorative to write.
Yeah. Hey, I'm glad you took the courage to do that. Well, I guess one of the things that I found it initially, it took me back to basics when I read it, was, your work around defining what suicide was, and the part that escaping the pain and the sense of entrapment is so fundamental to it. And then you link that to our good friend Thomas Joyner's work. And, you want to just talk a little bit about just how central that is in your perspective?
Yeah, so in 2011, I published sort of my theoretical model of suicide. And it was my attempt to bring together, at that stage would have been 10 or 15 years or whatever it was, 15 years working in the field, of trying to synthesize what was out there in terms of other theories, other understandings. And so that obviously involved in Thomas Joyner's work. And one of the things which was really influential to my mind about Thomas's work was Thomas recognized the fact that the factors that lead somebody to be suicidal are different from the factors that lead somebody to act on their thoughts. Now, other people had said that in the past, of course, but it was trying to make that in some way, he made that in a way really accessible. And then I've drawn a lot on work of Mark Williams, who's really influential in my career. Mark Williams, a psychologist at Oxford, and Mark had really developed this idea of the cry of pain, entrapment. And then so then in 2011, on the back of me having to write a book chapter on a handbook of the International Handbook of Suicide Prevention, which I was co-editing, and I had agreed to write a chapter on the psychology of suicide. And I thought, right, I was up against it, and I thought I'd use that as my opportunity to try and synthesize and really bring forward what I thought would be help people understand why people become suicidal, help people then understand this transition, which I talk in the book about, crossing the precipice from suicidal thoughts to suicidal acts. And then, but crucially, that use the model as a basis for interventions, for helping and supporting people, and people making sense of their own pain, as well as clinicians or loved ones or a teacher trying to understand why somebody feels the way they do. And at the heart of my model, which is what the integrated motivational volitional model, or the IMV model for short, is that suicidal thoughts, although they're complex, of course they have a biological part to them, of course they have a social part to them, they have a cultural part and a clinical part to them. So there's lots of factors that come together. But to my mind, if you're trying to understand why people become suicidal thoughts emerge when people feel trapped by mental pain, and that mental pain is often driven by the sense of being defeated or humiliated. I think there are key drivers. What we talk about as part of the final common pathway to becoming suicidal, people feeling defeated and humiliated. Those feelings of defeat and humiliation can also be triggered by rejection, by loss, and by shame. But the key point is then we're in a situation in which we're trapped by that mental pain of then feeling maybe a burden on others and feeling, my God, I'm such an awful person. And then you're caught in this cycle which escalates. And it's that being trapped, you feel trapped inside yourself mentally, effectively. And then that's when suicidal thoughts emerge, is what I would argue. And that's at the heart. So my question is always, if we're trying to understand why people feel suicidal, we need to understand why they feel trapped mentally. And then to answer that question, we have to usually take a lifespan approach and recognize that how suicidal I may feel now may be influenced by maybe experience of early life trauma or really adverse experiences in childhood, at any stage in their lifespan. But you're trying to make sense. You're trying to instead of saying what's wrong with somebody, it's trying to make sense of somebody's story of why it is, what is going on in their life. Part of it is biology. Yeah, we all have vulnerabilities, but that's only a small part of the puzzle. So it's vulnerabilities plus social context, plus disadvantage, plus whatever else is going on in your life. And but to me, the simple bit, and I don't want to minimize the complexity, but if we're trying to make sense of anything, we need to have a heuristic. And the heuristic is we're trying to understand suicidal thoughts emerging from this sense of being trapped by pain, which is driven primarily by defeat and humiliation. And the source of that defeat and humiliation can come from a whole host of places. And then the last thing I'll let you back in again, Sean, is this idea, when we think about what causes defeat or what causes or contributes to entrapment, we need to look beyond. It's not just individual things happening. It's looking at society, how society values or devalues groups of people. Why is it that people from more socially disadvantaged backgrounds, for example, are more at risk of suicide? Part of that is to do with, there's a whole set of complex reasons, but part of it is to do with how we value people who are socially disadvantaged or other minority groups, people from LGBTIQI plus groups feel just undervalued or shamed or whatever, discriminated against. So we need to look at that when we're understanding that sense of defeat and humiliation. It's about individual, community, societal, politicians, the role we all can play. Because the question then is, what can we do? And we've been doing this in Scotland when we're thinking now about our suicide prevention strategy. And we're currently refreshing it with hopefully a new plan in the next 12 months for the next 10 years. But we're asking questions like, what is contributing to entrapment at a community level, at an individual level? When somebody presents to clinical services in the emergency department, are they treated with compassion? Are they treated with respect, which would convey a sense of worthfulness rather than worthlessness? So it's complicated, of course, but yeah, it's at the heart of it is this sense of entrapment.
Yeah. So accepting there's a heck of a lot of complexity with, I've been touched by several friends who've taken their lives, and it feels like somebody sucks all the oxygen out of the room. For me, that's how it felt. And it takes you a long time to, I guess, find a kind of sense of understanding, if they can call it that, why somebody would have made the decisions they made. But it is, that whole concept of entrapment is fundamental in all three cases, when I look back on it. And I guess that question your country's looking at would be a good question for our country to start looking at. How do we, you can't necessarily address all pain in life, but you certainly can look at ways that you remove entrapment.
Well, absolutely. I mean, that's a key. So it's not about, because I accept that there's things that we can't control, but what we can do is identify, are there things that we can do which will ameliorate that risk, which will protect people, which will provide people with a sense of resilience. And I think that's the bit for me that we're trying to understand in a Scottish context, but in the research that we do, that's what we're always trying to do. We're trying to understand, okay, I can't change the fact that people from socially disadvantaged backgrounds, but I can do something about trying to ensure that they're treated in a way when they come in contact with clinical services or social services or any employment settings, that they're valued and they feel valued. And so I think there is something we can all do. And then the other thing I talk about in the book is, because some of that is, if we think it's so complex, it can seem so overwhelming. And if it seems so overwhelming, we think, oh, there's nothing we can do. Whereas we know from research throughout the world, there are things that we can do on a large level, but also on a small level. And I talk about people I've met in my journey who small things have helped interrupt their suicidal thoughts. So for me, when we think about intervention or prevention, of course, you're trying to prevent people becoming suicidal, right? And we should try our damnedest to do that. But if I can't stop somebody becoming suicidal, the next thing I can try to do is interrupt their transition from acting from their suicidal thoughts and crossing the precipice from thoughts to acts. And I talk a lot about the book about this trying to interrupt suicidal thoughts. And there's a whole chapter, for example, on safety planning, a way in which we can get people to think about warning signs escalating and then internal and external coping responses. That's one way. But also, I give examples of people, I mean, I've met who somebody smiled at them. Somebody, there was a sense of, so there's one guy I met, a friend, and he was so resolved that he was going to end his life, and he left to go out to just think about what he was going to do. And then it just so happened that he was walking through a park he normally walked through, and he basically, a lady he intermittently would see who share the same commute type idea, And she's noticed that he seemed to be whatever, in distress or whatever, something clicked. And she then, just as she walked past, and said, "Are you okay?" And for him, he just said to me, that was enough. It was all, he just felt, it was such a small thing, but she smiled initially, and then it was like, she looked as if she was concerned. And he just felt that was enough for him in that moment of crisis. And so suicide prevention is so much more complicated than this. But my point being, at that moment of crisis, that helped him interrupt his thoughts. And then he went back and then contacted his friend. His friend then encouraged him to speak to a GP. So there's things like that we can all do on an individual level, that sense of human connection. And I think that's a bit, one of the things, I think I end the book by trying to talk about this idea of when we are feeling about what we all can do, even though it is so difficult and we can never bring back the loved ones and the guilt I still experience about the 2 losses in my life. But what I can do is I can do my bit to hope to make somebody else feel a bit more connected, to help somebody else to think that actually that tunnel that when you're suicidal, that tunnel, you can't see options, you can't see a way out. It's a way of going, well, actually, there is light at the end of the tunnel. Suicidal thoughts are not constant. We know they come or go, they wax and wane. And what we're trying to do is do something to keep somebody safe in that moment of absolute crisis. Yeah. And that's what I suppose I tried to do in the book, was give people some light in the darkness, or some hope through the darkness of suicidal despair.
Probably like many countries, I think we've got a pretty good health system in New Zealand, but it's overwhelmed. There's good people working phenomenal hours, and you can't help but sense that they're burnt out. And I guess the more I read your book, the more I could feel the opportunity for peers in this work. People with lived experience, people with, we're not talking the clinical people, and I'm not demeaning psychologists and psychiatrists and mental health nurses. I think they're rock stars. There's absolutely no doubt, but there's not enough of them, and they look like their systems almost work against them sometimes. What's your view on that, and what's Scotland doing around that stuff?
Well, so for me, what's important to think about is, there's different parts of this puzzle. So when we think about prevention, there's different ways. There's early prevention, or in terms of prevention, obviously upstream or downstream, whatever way you want to frame it. And then there's crisis intervention, and then there's postvention. So we think about crisis intervention, that's usually when our highly skilled clinicians, or psychologists or psychiatrists, therapists of other kinds come into play. But and that's such an important role, and I totally agree with you on that. But the reality is, and I don't know the precise statistics for New Zealand, but I think they're about the same as the UK. And that is, most people who die by suicide are not in contact with clinical services in the 12 months before they die. It's less than 30% in the UK, and it's probably similar, as you're nodding and agreeing, Sean. Yeah. So what that illustrates then is, when we're thinking about prevention, in this multi-pronged approach to prevention or preventing suicide, we need to look at how else we can reach those people who are struggling, those people who would benefit. And that's where part of that is peer support and looking at innovative ways of reaching. I hate this term, and actually in Scotland, I think some members of our civil service and our government don't allow us to use this term, as hard to reach, because hard to reach is an incorrect term. Yeah. What it means is we have failed to reach these people. That's not hard to reach. We just haven't done it right? So, and what you need to do is look at new ways of reaching people. And what we're looking at, so a couple of things to note in Scotland we're doing. One is we're doing what's known as the Distress Brief Intervention Programme. Now, this is a very light touch, but gives you one example in which, so we're trying to intervene earlier. So people who are in distress, say they come in contact with, go to the emergency department, or they're come in contact with the police, or with their GP or social worker, or whatever. So what we will do is we'll offer them, no waiting list, up to 14 days of support, starting within 24 hours, right?
Wow.
And that 14 days of support is brief intervention. It's like, in some ways, it's a non-clinical intervention. It's delivered by trained mental health professionals. We've done the training and the delivery of it, of the intervention-based work. But it's helping people to basically problem solve and work together on a distress management plan. So things that we know have been worked in other contexts, but what we're trying to do is intervene early, but people don't have, so it's not about you, it's basically somebody come in contact with some professional, not necessarily a mental health professional, and we're saying, oh, we think you may benefit from this intervention, this support. So that's one way of breaking down barriers, and especially we think it's reach people who are traditionally more socially disadvantaged, who don't get through don't get through the waiting list of psychological treatment or get to their psychiatrist, and this is trying to fill that gap. And then one other thing I'd say, which has been, and other countries are doing this as well, but I think really important when I think of New Zealand is such a sporting nation, there's lots of examples now of using sports clubs, rugby, football clubs, cricket clubs, of a way of getting people, and my colleagues of mine in Glasgow have done this with physical health. They've worked with all the football clubs in Scotland and shown that basically they're using the person, this was for men's identity as a football fan, and that you would go to these interventions at your football club, right? And they're about weight loss and so on, but they weren't talked about as weight loss. They're talked about just mutual support. Let's catch up. Here's things which are good for your health. But that's shown to be really, really beneficial for physical health. And there's now pilots to look at how that can be done across the country for mental health. And I know there's lots of examples. I know I've heard certainly examples in Australia, and I bet you there's examples on New Zealand.
Yeah.
But that's another good example of us we're going to where the men are, in this case, men, 3/4 of all suicides, and certainly in the UK and also in New Zealand, go to where men are. Instead of us going this traditional model of going, oh, you have to go do this. We have to modify our models of support and engage men more. We still don't do enough of asking people. I'm just talking about men because they're a group we know are underserved. What would work for you? What do you want? What's helpful?
Yeah. Hey, I'm very encouraged by that work you're talking about there. And even in New Zealand, I think our captain of the All Blacks is actually one of the most vocal things on a online program that supports farmers, because
I think I've seen clips of that actually.
Yeah, and it's incredibly powerful, because obviously things like the climate change, it really impacts if you make your money from the land. It can have a lot of, so then you start getting down the financial difficulties, the business is struggling. Many of these people are multi-generational on the land, so they feel a sense of loss. And these are things we can actually see, but we're only just now learning how to respond to them.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think so I completely agree with that. But I think it's also this recognition that there's no one size fits all. Yeah. And certainly a group that I'm concerned about is young people now. And I know Australia or New Zealand has been affected differently from the pandemic than other parts of the world, certainly my country in the UK, where although the suicide rates haven't increased, my concern is there's lots of evidence of increased distress, right? And I think even before the pandemic and all sort of in the main sort of Western countries, so like in the Southern Hemisphere as well as the Northern Hemisphere, pre-pandemic, there was increased evidence of mental health problems increasing amongst our youth. And I think that's a group we really need to really focus on. And if you're just saying anything, if you add with that, the young people say in a family where you're supported by the land, as you say, looking ahead, that changes with climate change. And then how we then deal with that in that intergenerational way is so important.
Yeah. And I was actually, before this interview, I was listening to Greta talking at a World Environment Conference, and clearly that's one end of the scale, but there was a palpable sense of loss of hope by many young people. And to what degree do you think that hope's fundamental to that?
Well, I mean, although we don't, so what's tricky about these things is it's difficult to pin it down precisely. I'm a parent of 2 teenagers, and I know that their sense of hope in the future has been deflated, and that now, because if you think of it in our context in Europe, was obviously the whole idea of Brexit was another issue, whether it doesn't matter what your view on pro or anti-Brexit. That was a huge issue amongst our young people in particular, because most of our young people were in favor of staying within the European Union. But then the whole climate change thing, my daughter in particular feels this is just the fight of our generation, and we're failing to live up to that challenge. And then we've also come through, and is the Trump presidency, and that sense of hope. So there's this whole, speaking as a father of children who are really affected by those three big events, saying, my God, I look to the world and the future, and where is the hope? Where is the hope? And I think we have a responsibility as the generation above that to provide some of that hope. But it is remarkable. I mean, I love the energy that my children have and that generation have, but we need to be supporting them in that sense of hope. And that hope, though, that's at the macro level. But if you're on the ground now in the UK, for example, with most of the jobs that were lost during the pandemic were jobs what young people did, because they may be in catering or in hospitality or the caring professions. A lot of them, in particular the hospitality, and their schooling was interrupted badly interrupted because of COVID. So there's a whole generation now. It's different in each country of the world, but I think what we need to think about is what can we all do to create hope? And actually, if I just now quickly just mention, that's one of the reasons, and one part of the thinking behind the International Association for Suicide Prevention, which I have the honor of being president. This year in World Suicide Prevention Day, we launched our new triennial theme. And this year's theme, and for the next 2 years, will be creating hope through action. And what we're trying to do there is, we've been talking about hope for a long time, but we need to do something about it so we can create it. And I think that's like the example you're giving about the All Blacks. That's a great example of one person creating hope, right? He's creating hope, and we can't again underestimate the power of that of people in public in the public sphere. They have as role models creating hope for mental health. And we talk a lot in the UK about this levelling up agenda, and you'll have something similar, obviously, in Australia or in New Zealand. I keep saying Australia and New Zealand, but both parts of the Southern Hemisphere as well, about this equality between physical health treatment and mental health treatment. So we don't have these ridiculous waiting lists, and we don't have treatment which is tailored and matches the needs of the population.
It's a big challenge. But I certainly don't have a sense that it's insurmountable. So, because you're a little bit more expert in this area than I am, if you were picking 4 or 5 things we're going to do, and draw them from your book as well, how can we really get on the front of suicide prevention? Because it does seem we're chasing our tails a bit.
Yeah, well, it's worth saying though, when I started out in the field, and I think it's still true, New Zealand for a long time has led the way, and New Zealand, alongside your neighbours, your close neighbours, have really led the way for many years in really trying to think innovatively of new ways of not just of tracking, understanding the complex set of factors in some of your cohort studies, as well as obviously doing innovative work. So I think these are doing great work, but I think we all can learn from each other across the world. For me, I think if I was to say 3 things, let me think. So if I give one on prevention, so I would be looking to ensure that in schools, now we don't talk about suicide prevention, there's risks in doing that, but we do. So there is evidence that in a schools context, that peer mentoring programs have been shown to be effective in work led by Danuta Wasserman from Sweden. Her team has shown that this reduces suicidal thoughts and behaviors, these peer mentoring programs, which focus on mental health. So I would do something about trying to really focus in on that. Related to the early stuff is, we know in a lot of our work, we focus on and talk about this a lot in the book as well, is the role of trauma in early life adversity. We need to be doing more to mitigate the risk of young people experiencing traumatic events early on in life, because they confer vulnerability, never inevitability, but vulnerability. So we need to do more of that bit there of group of people who really have a whole set of, we obviously often talk about ACEs, these adverse childhood experiences. So I think there's something about that. Then if I was then to say something about a broader public health, it would be something on continue our anti-stigma campaigns and these role models of really getting that message out, of creating one thing we've started to do in Scotland, and we're trying to do it YAS, but the International Association for Suicide Prevention, is create a social movement for suicide prevention. And I think we really are trying to engage the community at all levels in a proper conversation and grow that social movement, because that comes back to the point we made earlier about this idea that most people who die by suicide aren't in contact with clinical services. So there's something about that, growing the social movement. And then the last bit I'll then say is getting, if it was a magic wand, is ensuring everybody who is in crisis has a safety plan, but a properly co-created safety plan, so that, and it's developed in collaboration with compassion, so that the individual has in that moment of crisis, hopefully got the resources to, first of all, identify when a crisis is escalating, and then obviously hopefully be able to identify internal or external coping responses to hopefully alleviate that crisis, it's not an or, it's an and a way of keeping their environment safe, keeping themselves safe in that moment of crisis. Because again, I come back to this point I made already. We know that when that suicidal crisis is really escalated, those thoughts are so intense, and you think that they'll never end, that's when you need that security. And there's a whole chapter building on the brilliant work that Barbara Stanley and Greg Brown have done, because they've pioneered this work from the United States. They've pioneered this work on safety planning, and we've done work with them in adapting their safety plan to a UK context. And so I think that's such an important bit, because what's important about the safety plan is, although it's normally completed in conjunction with a mental health professional, I think there's huge scope now on trying to look at other people to work collaboratively with somebody to help them understand why they're feeling suicidal or crisis is escalating, and ways of keeping you safe. And that's part of this. We all have a role to play in suicide prevention.
Hey, I've genuinely seen a lot of, I guess we'd call aligned professionals now start to do some pretty powerful work in this area. Recently, I was alerted to a kindergarten teacher who was spending a lot of time supporting mothers who were, I guess, extremely anxious and depressed, but some of them were coming very close to being suicidal as they as COVID and other things were happening. And having a toolkit that's helpful for that's a professional in a different area, but they're certainly not trained in mental health care, but having toolkits that are available for those sort of roles would be a really powerful thing, and basically it gets more people on the team.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, another thing we've done in the UK, which relates directly to that, is in the UK, and as part of the sort of reference group that developed some of this guidance, that NHS Education England, in conjunction with what's known as the National Collaborating Centre for Mental Health in London, a couple of years ago, just before maybe 2018, we published a competency framework for working with people who are suicidal or who self-harm. And the aim for doing that, there's an adult one, there's a children's one, there's a public health one. But the whole message, and actually it's detailed in the book as well, actually. The aim of that is trying to upskill the wider workforce, because any one of us, doesn't matter if you're a taxi driver or you're somebody who meets a porter in a hospital. These are people we're all coming into contact with people who are potentially suicidal. And it's trying to, or a teacher or whatever it may be, But the point is, we're trying to upskill or provide this framework so that training can be developed for other professionals beyond the mental health sphere. And there's ways of doing that. I think we need to do much more on doing that. And that's again something we're looking to do in Scotland when we think about our suicide prevention strategy moving forward. Really upskill, train, and also empower. And again, I touch a lot about this is the myths and the fears and anxieties still around suicide, and talking about suicide, like the myth that if you ask somebody about suicide, it plants the idea in their head. And indeed, the evidence, it's not only that is a myth, the evidence is to the opposite, is the contrary. So we know that there's some evidence, if you ask somebody directly whether they're suicidal, there is some evidence that actually increases the likelihood that somebody gets the help that they need. So part of it is breaking down or challenging those myths, so that if you are somebody like a teacher or a police officer or a nurse, physical ward, whatever, that asking those questions are okay, and it's important to ask those questions. And indeed, every GP, I think, should be asking those questions. And so I think there's a bit about, we still have a lot in terms of that public education about dispelling the myths. And then so that if you dispel the myths, because I think that fear is part of what's holding us back. And it's understandable fear. And again, this idea that if you ask somebody whether they're suicidal, and I think back to the very first time I asked that question of somebody I knew, I was petrified that they would come back and say yes. And again, I touch on this in the book, and I think it is so important, is that if we ask that question about whether somebody's suicidal, and we want the answer to be no because we're frightened, the answer will be no, because the person who's asked that question will sense that you don't really want to know the answer because it's difficult. Now, but we're open and compassionate. Hopefully the answer, if the person is suicidal, is yes. And then the other message is always ask twice, because sometimes the first time you ask somebody, they'll say, I'm fine. But asking the second time, I think is really powerful as well. So I think there's lots we do in empowering, dispelling myths, and then all of us working together, because we all have a really important role, even though that role might be small. But that small, because the impact of a small intervention. And I give you one example of, and I don't actually remember this happening, but this lady, I'm Irish, in case if anybody doesn't know, I live in Scotland, but being Irish is important to me. But a lady attended a talk I gave many years ago in Belfast in Northern Ireland. And in that message, I say something about this. I say something about, I don't know, some work we were doing on positive future thoughts and how suicidal thoughts come and go. I didn't think anything of it. It was just a standard public lecture I was given. And this lady came up to me at the end and I spoke to her. And again, I don't really remember the details. And then literally when the book came out earlier in the summer, I get this message saying there's this lady on Irish national radio saying that and it's not really about me. The point is, she said, so she attended this talk about, I gave that, something I said really resonated with her. And then also maybe a couple of years later, after I give that talk, she'd emailed me and I told her to hold on, or some positive message of hope. That was it. I wasn't doing anything special, but she said that's the reason she's still alive, right? But in that moment of crisis, and I'm not saying that to say I'm great. It's not about that. It's about this idea that that was just something small I said, and that idea that we all, that sense of human connection. She talked about that. She felt, I'd actually bothered to answer her email, because she was so low in her self-esteem and feeling she was such a worthless person. But this idea that I'd responded, together with this some other thing about something I'd said about hope or whatever it was, but that helped her through that crisis. So really, I urge anybody listening to this, please, this idea of, we all think about reaching in. How can we reach in? What can we do to help others? Because the narrative for many years has been reach out, people should reach out if they're in distress. Of course, you should do that, but lots of people find that difficult. So of course, we encourage reach out, but also reach in so we can think about what we can do to support others.
Yeah, hey, that's a powerful message. And I've been touched many times by a kind word, or just somebody speaking at the right thing at the right time, and showing
Yeah.
as you mentioned it, there are 3 or 4 times in my life, in recent life, that I've been brought to tears by little pieces of compassion, and
Yeah.
I think we at our peril devalue those,
Yeah.
because those little pieces of compassion are fundamental to the human connection.
But there's also the other bit of compassion is self-compassion.
Mm.
And that's more difficult for us because, especially if you're in that sense of feeling you're a burden on others, and you just have continually, metaphorically, whatever, having battles with yourself. It's trying to help all of us be more compassionate towards ourselves as well as others. And I think self-compassion sometimes is much more difficult. Well, I probably find that more difficult personally, but I think that is something we need to, as a country, as a society, think about, and then challenge these stereotypes about what it is to be a man or a woman or whatever gender identity you have identified with. That's all that stuff. We need to really work on those things as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Rory, we're getting towards the end of our chat. So how can people get hold of your book? What's the easiest way for people?
I'm assuming, I'm hoping you can buy it in all online bookstores, I assume, and obviously the big A, the Amazon, obviously will stock it, and I'm not quite certain what would be the equivalent, if there's an equivalent local one, obviously in New Zealand, and certainly it's obviously available paperback and an ebook, and I've just agreed terms to do an audiobook, which will come out. The audiobook version will come out next year. So it should be available. But if you can't struggle with that, but you should be able to get it on those. But if not, there's Book Depository. The bookdepository.com does free delivery of books anywhere in the world. And that's another one. So it should be there. And hopefully, please encourage your local bookshops to stock it. I'm keen that our libraries, so people get the message out there. That sounds a bit. But anyway, I mean that in the best way possible.
Hey, I can tell you that I'm reading it on the Kindle because I can't get it delivered by my local bookstore for another 6 weeks. They tell me a lot of deliveries in this part of the world have been disrupted with COVID and stuff like that. So we've got half a dozen that we're going to give a few away. We've got some people in mind already for that, because we think it's that good. So if you're buying a book, anyone, we think you should buy 2 and give one away to somebody else who will get something from it, but more importantly, be able to give something from it. And I think that's a very powerful thing. Rory, your work as president of the international organization, I really commend. And specifically, I love that whole approach of hope. So when our borders open next year, this is a formal invitation to get you out here, and let's run a conference of hope, because suicide prevention often comes with a kind of a black cloud over it. As soon as you mention, I'm going to a suicide prevention conference, whereas if we can take it from a perspective of a life-affirming way, that we've all got a part to play in it, I think that's just very, very powerful, and I'd personally like to support that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it is so important that it is framed in that way, but it's a fine balance, because, of course, many people who attend the conferences that we're involved in are obviously bereaved as well, and what I'm always keen is to highlight that part of it is helping, even though we, as I've said already, we can't bring back our loved ones. We can hopefully better understand maybe why they died, but also have you a sense of understanding your pain, you're not alone, and that sense of community. And I attended, there's this big bereavement conference every year in the UK, and they often talk about where those of us who are bereaved by suicide are in this unenviable club, and it's that club of being bereaved by suicide. But there's something about that connection of being bereaved, that sense of not being alone, and that sense of hope that things will hopefully improve. If you're still really struggling, it'll never be the same, of course, but also hope that we can all do something to prevent the devastation of suicide happening to others.
Cool. Well, I think there's many people who'd love to welcome you here too. I had to pass on a few welcomes from my friend Annette Boutray. And
hello Annette. Hopefully you're watching this. Annette, I'll catch you at some stage.
And Mike Ang, who's working in suicide prevention, he's a psychiatrist at Counties Manukau, and a number of others. So I'm sure they'll all be welcome to host you next year too. So thank you for this time.
If our borders open, I'm not as hopeful as you yet, but anyway, but fingers crossed. Yeah, I'd be delighted to, if I can make another trip to your beautiful country. That'd be fantastic. Thanks a million for the invitation, Sean, and I really enjoyed our conversation, and hopefully people find it helpful.
Okay, thank you very much. You can go to sleep now.
I can. I'm going to bed now. Great.
Bye.
Good night. Take care. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.